Don't touch Tu Tien. This is Mom's decision. Mom, why did you give all the assets to them and not me?
It's my decision, and I don't need to explain myself to you. Mother has decided this is the mistake that Mother must fix with the ancestors.
In a dimly lit room, the only light came from a phone screen. Jack's older brother leaned back in his chair, his cold eyes fixed on the message he had just received. Madame Loy has transferred all her assets to Jack and Tu Tien. He read it once, then again. The silence in the room was so heavy that even his breathing became louder. "That's impossible," he muttered. His fingers tightened around the phone. Thoughts began to spiral in his mind. That wealth should have been his. He was the eldest son. He was the one who deserved it. His expression slowly changed from shock to anger, then to something colder. A faint smirk appeared. "She gave everything to him?" he whispered, his voice filled with mockery. He stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights were still bright, alive, as if nothing had happened. But inside this room, a storm was forming. "Fine," he said, his voice low but firm. "If they want to play, I'll play until the end." He grabbed his car keys. There was no hesitation left in his eyes. Only one thing remained: greed. The car sped through the night. Streetlights flashed across the window, reflecting on Jack's brother's tense face. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed ahead. But his mind was elsewhere. "All the assets," he murmured. Old memories began to flood back, the times he felt overlooked, the moments when Madame Loy placed more trust in Jack. And now, everything made sense. "She never saw me as worthy," he clenched his teeth. A sense of injustice rose within him, blending with a growing greed. It wasn't just about money, it was about recognition. "No, I can't let this happen." He pressed harder on the accelerator. His eyes turned cold. A decision had been made. He would take everything back. The next morning, the car stopped in front of the house. He stepped out, adjusting his shirt, his eyes scanning the familiar place. Everything looked the same, but the feeling was different. He pushed the gate open and walked inside. In the yard, Jack and Tu Tien were talking. The sound of footsteps made them turn around. The atmosphere instantly shifted. "Brother?" Jack said in surprise. Tu Tien froze as well. No one expected him to show up. At this moment, he smiled, but it wasn't a warm one. "Long time no see," he said. His voice was calm, but carried something unreadable. Jack looked at him, sensing something was off. A bad feeling crept in. The three of them stood facing each other. The distance between them wasn't far, but the tension was heavy. Jack spoke first. "Why are you here?" His brother didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his gaze shifting from Jack to Tu Tien. Then he stopped. "I heard Mom transferred all the assets." As soon as the words fell, the air froze. Tu Tien tightened her hand slightly. Jack remained silent for a moment. "That was her decision," he said slowly. His brother laughed, a cold laugh. "Decision?" he repeated. His eyes sharpened. "Or did someone influence her?" The accusation didn't name anyone, but everyone knew who he meant. Tu Tien said nothing, yet her gaze remained calm. The tension had only just begun. The tension in the air grew heavier by the second. Jack's brother stepped forward, his gaze fixed on them. "I'll be direct," he said coldly. "That inheritance cannot belong to just the two of you." Jack clenched his fists. "What are you talking about?" he asked. His brother smirked. "I'm simply taking back what should have been mine." Tu Tien remained still, not reacting immediately. "That was Mother's decision," she said softly but clearly. He turned to her, his eyes sharp. "Do you think you have the right to speak here?" The words cut like a blade. But Tu Tien remained calm. Jack stepped forward, standing between them. "Don't talk to her like that," he said, his voice controlled but firm. The air felt like it might explode. The battle had begun. Jack stood firmly in front of Tu Tien. "Say what you want, to me," he said. His brother laughed, full of mockery. "You think you can protect her?" Jack didn't step back. "This isn't just her problem," he replied. Behind him, Tu Tien looked at Jack, her eyes slightly shaken. It was the first time. He had stood up for her so clearly. Jack's brother stepped closer. "You've changed," he said. "Or did she change you?" Jack tightened his fists. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. He was no longer the younger brother who stayed silent, no longer someone easily controlled. This time, he wouldn't step back. "That's enough," a voice echoed from inside the house. All three turned at once. Madame Loy stood at the doorway, her expression stern. She walked out slowly, each step steady. The atmosphere instantly shifted. "What are you doing?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Jack's brother looked at her, his voice filled with frustration. "How can you even ask? I just want fairness." Madame Loy looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes held no hesitation now, only determination. "That inheritance," she said slowly, "was my decision." Jack and Tu Tien remained still. His brother clenched his fists. "And what about me?" A question, loaded with pressure. The entire space fell silent. A choice was about to be made. The air turned heavy. Jack's brother stepped forward, unable to hide his anger. "Fairness?" he sneered. "You call this fairness?" Madame Loy remained silent. "I'm the eldest son," he continued, his voice rising. "I should inherit everything." Tu Tien stayed quiet, not interrupting. Jack clenched his fists but kept his composure. "You're going too far," Jack said. "Too far?" His brother turned sharply, eyes full of challenge. "Or are you afraid to face the truth?" The atmosphere grew suffocating. Madame Loy sighed softly. She understood. This anger wasn't just about money. It came from wounds that had been building for years. Madame Loy closed her eyes for a moment. Old memories surfaced. The times she showed favoritism, the moments she hurt Tu Tien, and the times she unintentionally neglected her eldest son. She opened her eyes. Her gaze was now calm, but heavy. "Do you think I've never been wrong?" she asked. Jack's brother froze. He hadn't expected that question. "I've made many mistakes," she continued, her voice slow but clear. Tu Tien was slightly surprised. It was the first time she had admitted it. Jack looked at his mother, his expression shifting. The tension softened, but deepened in another way. Silence filled the space. Madame Loy looked at each of them. On one side was her son. On the other, a daughter-in-law she had once hurt, yet who had silently sacrificed so much. Her gaze rested on Tu Tien. Memories of her care, her kindness, became clear. Then she turned to her son. The conflict was visible. "You want fairness," she said slowly. He nodded firmly. "Yes." She took a deep breath. "But fairness isn't always the same for everyone." The words hung in the air. Jack looked at his mother. Tu Tien did too. A decision was approaching. The space fell silent. Madame Loy stood firm, her eyes no longer hesitant. She looked directly at her son. "I've made my decision." Her voice wasn't loud, but it held weight. Jack's brother frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned to Tu Tien, her gaze softening. "The one I choose is Tu Tien." The words struck like lightning. Jack froze. Tu Tien stood still, and his brother, his face darkened. "That's impossible," he muttered. But Madame Loy didn't step back. "It's not because I don't love you," she said, "but because I know who deserves to hold what remains." The air grew heavy. A choice had been made. "No, I won't accept this!" Jack's brother exploded. He stepped forward, his voice filled with rage. You're being manipulated by her. Tu Tien frowned slightly but remained silent. Jack immediately stepped in front of her. Stop it, Jack said. Stop? His brother laughed loudly. Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? The tension snapped tight. Madame Loy stepped forward. That's enough. Her voice was stronger than ever. Her son turned back. Then tell me, why her? The question echoed, like a challenge, like a demand for truth. Madame Loy looked straight at her son. No more avoiding. Because you were never here when I needed you. The words stunned him. But she was, she continued, gesturing gently toward Tu Tien. She stayed by my side when I was at my weakest. Her voice trembled. She took care of me. She sacrificed. Tu Tien lowered her head slightly. Jack stood still. His brother said nothing. Everything had been revealed. It was no longer about money. It was about truth. The space fell into a heavy silence. Jack's brother stood still, his eyes wavering for the first time since he arrived. I didn't know, he said quietly, his voice no longer sharp. Madame Loy looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and firmness. It's not that you didn't know. It's that you never wanted to know. The words stopped him. Faint memories surfaced, missed calls, times he chose work over family. He clenched his fists, but this time not out of anger, out of emptiness. Tu Tien remained silent. No accusations, no resentment. That silence made everything clearer than ever. Jack's brother took a step back. The sharpness in his eyes had faded. Only exhaustion remained. So, it's over? He asked, his voice low. No one answered immediately. Jack looked at him, seeing for the first time that he was no longer as strong as before. Brother, Jack began, but stopped. His brother gave a faint smile, a sad one. Maybe I was wrong. The words were quiet, but heavy. He turned and walked toward the gate. No more arguments, no more anger, just a man leaving in silence. The gate closed. The space became unusually quiet. Madame Loy exhaled as if releasing a heavy burden. Tu Tien stood still, her eyes calm. Jack stepped closer and gently held her hand. Are you okay? He asked. She nodded. I'm okay. Not because it was easy, but because she had learned to accept. Madame Loy looked at them, her gaze softening. Thank you, she said to Tu Tien. Tu Tien shook her head gently. Family is about getting through things together. A simple sentence, but enough to end everything. The afternoon sunlight filled the yard. No more conflict, no more pain, only
Hôm nay
peace.
mình sẽ trình bày câu chuyện về Toàn, một người đàn ông sống với những ký ức đã mất. Khi anh dần dần xây dựng cuộc sống của mình thông qua những công việc thường nhật giản dị và sự chăm sóc thầm lặng của những người xung quanh. Dưới ánh mắt theo dõi của một bà lão, Toàn đã bắt đầu thấy vững vàng trở lại. Dù câu hỏi về quá khứ vẫn tiếp tục làm anh trăn trở. Trung tâm của sự bối rối ấy là Tử Diễm, một cô gái trẻ tốt bụng và tận tâm. Người mà sự ấm áp, gần gũi của cô khơi gợi những tia sáng le lói của những ký ức bị lãng quên. Mặc dù anh không thể nhớ mình đã yêu cô ấy như thế nào, nhưng sự hiện diện của cô mang lại cho sự an ủi, hy vọng và khát khao lớn lao. Muốn tìm lại cho con người mình trước đây. Qua công việc chung, những cuộc trò chuyện nhẹ nhàng, những khoảnh khắc bình dị, tràn đầy ấm áp, Toàn nhận ra rằng sự chữa lành không phải là lúc nào cũng đến từ việc nhớ lại mọi thứ cùng một lúc, mà đến từ việc sống và yêu thương, tin tưởng những người luôn ở bên cạnh anh khi anh thấy lạc lõng nhất.